Welcome, fellow geeks, to the Geek Test. My name is Simon, and this is where we here at Bennett's BikeSocial take a new bike and get geeky with it on the dyno, performance testing, measuring real-world tank range and fuel consumption, measuring the riding position and ergonomics, and weighing it. Oh, and not forgetting a 250-mile ride around the Geek Test route of motorways, A roads, B roads, and in town. And the subject of this week's Geek Test is Honda's 2024 CBR600RR. But first, let's geek out on some history. And there's a lot of it. The CBR600 has been around, at least the name has, since 1987, when the first CBR600 was launched at Suzuka Circuit in Japan. The CBR stands for City Bike Racing, was one of a new breed of high-tech water-cooled inline-four sporty middleweights with full fairings, 16 valves, double overhead cams and, for the time, sky-high red lines. Before the CBR, your average middleweight sports bike was an air-cooled 550, but bikes like Kawasaki's GPZ600R, Yamaha's FZR600 and Honda's CBR changed all that. The CBR made a claimed 85 horsepower, about 75 bhp at the back wheel, and it did 140 miles an hour, which is a decent top speed on that much power, partly because the CBR was not just fully faired, it was fully enclosed in bodywork. And that was why it was instantly nicknamed the Jelly Mould. Road testers of the day raved about how the CBR felt sporty enough to race, but practical on the road at the same time. In the USA, the CBR won every single AMA Supersport race in its first year, while over here there was no Supersport series yet, so for its first year, Honda ran a one-make CBR600 challenge with over 60 CBRs fighting it out across two heats and a final. Let's have a quick pause here and listen to the unmistakable sound of the late great Murray Walker.
A new leader over the line. Eric McFarlane takes the lead, and in behind him it's 1, 2, well, you count them, I can't.
I could watch that all day. In 1987, I was 18, bombing around on an RD125LC, and I distinctly remember reading the road tests and dreaming of riding a Jelly Mould CBR600 around my favourite roads. Anyway, that was just the start for the CBR. Over the next decade, the steely-framed Honda went on to win everything. Multiple TTs, British Supersport titles, and just about every 600cc group test going. I remember those bikes well because I was lucky enough to ride most of them. Every year it seemed whatever new 600 the other manufacturers threw into the mix, the CBR always seemed to somehow come out on top. It was such a good all-rounder. The CBR won in the showroom too. Between 1987 and 2006, Honda sold over 250,000 CBRs in Europe. And even as late as 2002, it was still the best-selling bike in the UK. But Honda must have reckoned the CBR600F's greatest strength, its road and race compromise, was going to be a weakness in the new super competitive Supersports noughties, because in 2003 they split the CBR lines. The CBR600 F4i continued as the road-orientated CBR600, but the CBR600RR was introduced as the track-orientated version. It was the first Honda to be developed in collaboration between Honda's race department, HRC, and Honda's road bike R&D. Previously, the two were always separate. I've heard stories that HRC were a bit sniffy about road bike R&D, but this time the two departments worked together to the extent that the lead engineer for the CBR600RR, Hijiro Yoshimura, was previously leader for the MotoGP RC211V. And, like the 600F, the CBR600RR was a huge racing success. It won the World Supersport title in its first year in 2003, and it won it for the next 7 years in a row. I actually rode the 2004 CBR600RR World Supersport winning bike as Carl Mugridge's Tenkate CBR at Jerez in November 2004. Obviously, it was blisteringly quick, but I was riding another bike that day that sort of put it in the shade a little bit. Anyway, time waits for no man, not even Soichiro Honda. And by the late 2000s, the arse had completely fallen out of Supersport 600 sales, going from thousands of bikes every year to a few hundred almost overnight. Although Honda gave the CBR motor a second life as the control engine in Moto 2 between 2010 and 2018. But development of the CBR slowed down as interest waned. And every year it looked and felt a bit more of an anachronism in the modern motorcycling world of adventure bikes and middle-aged spread. So as the CBR got smaller, we got bigger. When we were 18, it was awesome. But by our mid-40s, it was small, cramped, had a crap tank range and just too many revs, you know. Inevitably, in 2016, Honda announced that they were axing the CBR600RR in the UK, and 2017 was the last year it came here, and that seemed to be that. But I think the CBR was still sold in the US and was brought back into Japan and Southeast Asia in 2021, and renewed interest in the supersports class gave Honda the impetus it needed to update the CBR600RR for Euro 5 Plus, and they relaunched it in the UK. And so here we are in 2024 with a new CBR600RR. And although it looks much the same as the old CBR600RR, there are some differences. But can it make an old man happy again? Let's find out and get into some geekery. The bare bones is the 2024 CBR600RR motor is much the same as the 2017 CBRs, and back even further than that. It's the same 599cc 16 valve inline 4, it's the same valve sizes as back in the 2007 bike, it's the same 12.2:1 compression ratio, even the same 67mm bore and 42.5mm stroke as the old CBR600FX back in 1999. So there's a lot inside this engine that's done the rounds, literally. The changes for 2024 include new lighter alloys used for the cams, the valve springs and the crank, with altered cam timing. Intake valves close 5 degrees later, exhaust valves open 5 degrees earlier, which gives the same lift and the same overlap with more duration. This is coupled with a cleaning up of the intake ports, removing a lip in the port mouth and wider 44mm throttle bodies up from 40mm, plus a revised exhaust with a larger repositioned catalyst. And if you think I'm geeky, look how deep a manufacturer has to go to clear Euro 5 Plus. Compared to the 2017 CBR exhaust, the 2024 bike's exhaust has narrower headers by 3.2mm, wider link pipes by 4.9mm, wider collector pipes by 2.3mm, plus they've removed the old bike's flapper valve, and then they've removed another valve in the end can, and then added a few baffle tubes. It's a bonkers level of tuning to get the motor through emissions without, ideally, filling the old power curve full of holes. I say ideally, we'll come back to that. Anyway, to find out what the actual power and torque measurements are, we took the CBR down to BSD Race Developments in Eye Green near Peterborough, where I've been taking bikes to be dynoed for over 20 years. And here's the amazingly talented Andy firing the CBR onto the dyno and running it up with a steady hand. And this is what he got. 109 horsepower and 44 pound-foot of torque. But is it me, or are we suddenly thinking, well, that's not quite so impressive? I mean, haven't Sport 600s been knocking out just over 100 horsepower for ages? Well, yes, they have. So here, the blue line is what a CBR600RR was doing 10 years ago in 2014 on the same dyno, pre-Euro 5 and pre-Euro 4, I think. Same peak power, but just look at the difference in the mid-range. The 2014 motor is making more below 6,000 RPM, but from there it takes off and leaves the new engine for dust. So while Honda have undoubtedly worked hard to maintain the new CBR's peak power, ultimately it's got a bigger, more restrictive bung in the exhaust. And unless you make your engine physically larger, which is what a lot of manufacturers did to pass Euro 5, your engine, especially one that's relatively small capacity and already fairly highly tuned, will inevitably lose a lot of oomph. Maybe that's why Honda have also geared the 2024 CBR down with a larger rear sprocket to try and give it back a bit more pep. Here's another graph, just for fun. Check out this. The green line is from a 2004 CBR600RR. So we're right back at the start of the RR 20 years ago. And even that has more go in the mid-range. and it just shaves a bit off the BHP at the top end. And just to be really daft, from my vast dyno archive, we can rewind 30 years. The black line is a 1994 CBR600RR. Don't ask me why the line starts at 5,000 RPM, probably because nobody rode below 5,000 RPM on a 600 in 1994. But again, look at that mid-range. And it's interesting to note the peak torque too. It's pretty much the same peak figure, 42 pound-foot versus the current CBR600RR's 44 pound-foot, which goes to show Honda were pretty close to optimum volumetric efficiency of a 600cc 16-valve inline-4 30 years ago. The engine was already punching as hard as physics will allow. All they could do in 30 years is just make it punch faster. And one more dyno. Look what happens to a 600 when you add 50cc. This is a 2024 CBR650R, and it shows a clean pair of heels to the RR all the way up to nearly 11,000 RPM. So the next time you go for a ride, ask yourself how often you'll be revving even a 600 to over 11 zillion RPM. Right, that's enough dyno chat. Let's measure the CBR's performance. Unfortunately, we can't afford our own private drag strip, so we're limited to a 0 to 60 time and a top gear roll-on between 40 to 60 miles an hour. 0 to 60s. Now, I'm pretty rubbish at 0 to 60s, plus I forgot to disable the CBR's anti-wheelie. So the best I managed was a shameful 4 seconds, which is worse than the F900 GSA I tested in the last Geek Test. Although the run on that bike completely fried the BMW's clutch, which was something I was quite keen not to do on the CBR. So I got one go at it, and it took 4 seconds, and my shame is here for all to see forever. Please let me know how rubbish I am in the comments section down below. As for top gear roll-on times, even with a larger rear sprocket, looking at that absentee mid-range on the dyno, I'm not expecting great things in top gear. The F900 GSA on the last Geek Test went from 40 to 60 miles an hour in top gear in 4 seconds, and it took 47 metres to do it. The CBR takes over 5 seconds and a whopping 115 metres, nearly twice as much distance. Granted, it's comparing, I don't know, fish and bicycles. No one on a Sport 600 isn't going to shift down and absolutely boot it. But what it does show is for a given riding pace, something like a modern middleweight adventure bike is a lot easier to generally hoof about on without breaking a sweat. And Enduro 5 has indeed absolutely hammered the CBR's mid-range. In town, the CBR is actually pretty civilised. The engine is easy to ping around and keep on the boil. Response from the ride-by-wire throttle is perfect. It doesn't feel noticeably lacking in mid-range in traffic. And there's always more than enough drive to bat away from anything. The clutch is feather light. Honda say it's 30% lighter than before. And the up and down quick shifter, now standard and three-way adjustable for the aggressiveness of its shift, is perfectly spot on. On A-roads, the motor is a bit more frustrating to use than in town if you want to stick religiously to speed limits, because here the mid-range deficit really does show up. The bike only wants to go places really fast. It's not uncivilised at low speed, it's just the package is designed to be at its optimum when it's doing the kind of pace you might have thought was fine when you were younger, when you didn't care as much about getting nicked. But these days, I mean, it's definitely a proper laugh, but in a really serious kind of way. Riding like that definitely has a fairly limited lifespan. Because it's had so much of the mid-range sucked out of it, basically the bike has 2 modes. Pootling about nowhere near where the fun is, and then screaming its ass off. There's nothing in between. No driving through the mid-range, no short shifting at mid-revs and actually going places. It's all or nothing. But overall, the CBR isn't a demanding engine to use, and it feels amazing, especially when it's howling. But you can't help wondering if car drivers and pedestrians look at you and think you should probably grow up a bit and start acting your age. But when the mood takes you, no one's listening, it's just you and me, right? by crikey, it doesn't half feel good to ping it off the red line and cut loose. It's still got the magic. The engine still screams. It's actually surprisingly loud. And the popping when the next gear goes in is so addictive. If you want to ride like an absolute hooligan, it's an itch only a 600 Supersports inline 4 can scratch. But I have to say, it's been a long time and I'm not sure if I want to have that itch again. At this point, I should probably mention the CBR600RR's suite of electronics because it's one of the main differences over the 2017 bike. The 24 bike has, as you'd expect these days, a 6-axis IMU, which opens up proper traction control with 9 levels, 3 levels of wheelie control, 3 levels of engine braking, 3 engine modes, 2 user modes, plus cornering ABS, and a lap timer function, all via a new TFT dash. The dash is functional. It's small, you might have to squint a bit, and I've got to be honest, I tried the various settings, and most of them I could barely tell the difference, if at all, during normal road riding. The modes don't have names, just 1, 2, 3 and 2 user modes. 3 is most like a rain mode, which I'd guess I'd use if it rains, but it didn't while I had the CBR, so I mostly had it in user mode with mostly minimum everything. Right, let's talk chassis spec, handling and weight. In the same way the CBR's engine doesn't hold too many surprises over the 2017 bike, neither does the chassis. The frame is the same die-cast aluminium twin spar as before, and the swing arm looks the same to me, although Honda say it's 150 grams lighter, but I can't really see where they've saved it. Maybe they've taken a few lugs off. Suspension is familiar too, fully adjustable 41mm Showa forks and a Showa Unit Pro Link rear, as before. Honda have extended the fork length 15mm and there's a good chunk sticking out above the top yoke, which looks very cool, and it gives racers more options for altering front end ride height. Brakes are the same Tokiko radials on 310mm discs, and as for the steering geometry, it's barely changed with about half a degree less rake angle and 2mm more trail, and wheelbase is down 5mm, possibly because of the larger rear sprocket. Tyres are Dunlop Road Sport 2s on the same slim spoke cast wheels as before, and they're good tyres. When you first get on the Honda, they take a while to warm up and give you really gooey, grippy feedback feeling so that you trust the front end. But once you get cracking, they actually stick really well and they have a neutral feel. If anything, they're almost a bit characterless. I suspect the Honda will really be responsive to different tyres, and you might well go through a few different sets until you find something that really suits the way you ride. Honda claimed the curb weight is down to 193 kilos from 196 in 2017. I wish I lost weight as fast as that as I got older. Anyway, I checked, and on the Geek Test bathroom scales, a fully clothed CBR600RR weighs at 195.1 kilos with 51% on the front wheel and 49% on the rear wheel. That weight is nearer the old claimed figure than the new one, but maybe petrol was lighter in 2017? On the road, the CBR is light, insanely flickable and pretty good in traffic. It's so slim you can squeeze through gaps bigger bikes can't. It fires into roundabouts, it feels nice and secure on its wheels, and it steers by mind control alone. Obviously on bumpy back roads it gets seriously choppy. It's a light, stiff sports bike, that's what you expect. But it's a stark reminder of exactly why British riders fell out of love with supersports bikes. There are some bumps and yumps on my regular Fenland commute that literally have the whole bike leaping off the road. There's a whole lot of riding jockey style off the seat, letting the bike move about below. Stability is never an issue. Honda's speed-sensitive steering damper keeps it all under control. And on smoother roads, the suspension improves exponentially. By the time you hit the really smooth stuff, if you can find any, the CBR is so poised and measured, it's like riding a pair of vernier calipers. I can only imagine how good it would feel at Cadwell Park on a summer's evening. Because really, that's where the CBR belongs. It's where the engine and the suspension can really start to make sense. To my blunt old senses, the CBR is sharp, it's alive, it's dedicated to cornering, and it fires into apexes so hard it took me a while to recalibrate my brain and my riding. It's been a while since I rode anything this eager to turn, or anything that stops so efficiently. And speaking of braking, I had to go in the Geek Test braking zone from 60 miles an hour down to 0, and the CBR stopped in 26.3 metres and 3.120 seconds, pulling 1G. That's seriously impressive. I could feel the Honda's ABS kicking in because the lever kind of goes a bit solid and some of the feel disappears. But by that point, you're trying not to go over the handlebars. It's not the pulsing at the lever kind of ABS. You can actually stoppie the CBR if you grab the lever sharply enough. And it feels so different to most other road bikes. You sort of get used to the long legs and the long suspension travel of adventure bikes, where it takes so long for the chassis to actually do anything. You've got time to work out what you're going to do about it. But the CBR is completely different. It's much more instant and intense, as if the chassis is in so much more of a hurry to do its thing. You've got to bring your A game to the CBR. Otherwise, what's the point? No prizes for guessing the CBR is small. The big question is it too small for a big old fella? It's got an 820mm seat height, the clip-ons are obviously low and narrow, the pegs are high, and so, yes, to get your head behind the screen and ride the CBR like you mean it, it's just not physically possible for a fat 56-year-old. And if you want to know why so few people buy Supersport 600s, we can stop there. But don't let's confuse a compact riding position with being uncomfortable, because it isn't. It sounds mad. Hear me out, and then you can disagree down below. A sports bike riding position is a fetal position. We all spent about 9 months in that position once, and I don't remember complaining about it much then. And ergonomically, it's not a bad posture. You get those ergonomic office chairs, and some of them seem to have a fairly sports bike riding position. It's because it distributes your body weight more evenly. Some on your wrists, some on your feet, some on your arse. Your body, toes on the pegs, becomes almost suspended on the bike like a counterweight, exactly what it should be, helping to damp out the bike's movement when it needs to, augmenting it when it needs to. If you ride with your head canted forward, not crammed behind the screen, and you keep up enough speed to have wind pressure take the weight off your wrists, then I reckon a sports bike position is, over long distance, pretty comfy. Anyway, the CBR is tiny. 600s have shrunk to the same kind of proportion as 400s used to have back in the day. Here's an overlay of a CBR600RR against a CBR400RR gull arm from 1990. In fact, the 400 actually has a roomier riding position. The hip to foot distance is roughly the same, but it's a longer stretch to the bars for the 400. Either way, the point is there's not a lot in it. For comparison, here's the 600RR against a 1992 CBR600FN. You can't help wondering if Honda wouldn't sell a few more CBR600RRs to old gits if the riding position was a bit more FN than RR. Or maybe that's what the CBR650R is for. I don't know. So where are we? On the road, the CBR is compact, petite, makes big old lump like me feel slightly self-conscious unless no one's looking. But not to worry, the RR has a 17-litre tank, and on the Geek Test nearly run dry test, we used up 16.35 litres in 153.4 miles with 13 miles left. That's 43 miles per gallon in a standard mix of legal motorways, A road getting a shift on, and B road total hoonery. I just checked my road test from 1992 of CBR600 FN, and guess what? It did 43.8 miles per gallon on a 16-litre tank, and I don't remember complaining about tank range back then. Mind you, it was 32 years ago. The CBR comes with few frills. I was pleased to note it has the same little bungee lugs on the number plate assembly that it had back in 2003. Is that a good thing? Because it shows how little the CBR has actually moved on since then. You can actually spec a few extras for your CBR. You can get a comfort pack, no really, which it adds a USB port, a tail pack and heated grips. I like the sound of them. That's 510 quid. Or you can get the racing pack, which is wheel stripes, a seat cowl, anodised oil filler cap and a tank pad. That's £270, and the keen-eyed among you will have noticed that's exactly what we had on the bike here. That would bring the price of the standard CBR600RR, which is £10,529, to £10,852. Now, there's two ways you can look at nearly 11 grand for the CBR. On the one hand, you're paying 11 grand for a 600cc sports bike that's had its mid-range culled compared to its predecessors, but has more electronics than they did, and which is a bit, how should we say, focused, dedicated, obsessed with speed, which actually doesn't sound so bad now I say it. And on the other hand, you're talking A tightly packed ball of high-revving sports fury, the like of which you just can't get unless you go for a Kawasaki ZX6R, which costs about the same as the CBR and offers much the same experience. I haven't actually ridden a Euro 5 model, but I think it's a cheaty 636cc, so it might have a bit more in the middle, and I seem to remember the riding position is a bit more generous than the CBR. So anyway, you know, you think only 11k for a CBR600 Super Sports, that had got to be so much better than one of those ploopy parallel twins soft 600cc sports bikes, and it is. More power, more electronics, better suspension, a whole heap more ability, and it's a bit more demanding too. So I don't know, I reckon that makes the CBR pretty cheap considering it's come back from retirement with more tech and less mid-range. Still, as someone from Honda said to me the other day, they're selling loads of them, so happy days for Honda. Anyway, enough of me. You should be outside riding your bike, not watching this. Remember to get your insurance from Bennett's, become a BikeSocial member and take advantage of all their offers and competitions and bonuses. Get yourself signed up to Bike Club and find answers to questions you didn't even know you had. And download Front End Chatter, Britain's grumpiest biking podcast, from the Bennett's website or from frontendchatter.com. And all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon with a big German adventure bike.